So please, who wants to go in next? We have 3 other presentations speakers. So we have had 2, I don't want to be gender, whatever, because we are all the same. So please, who wants to go next? Okay. Is Dr. Sweli Consaso on ground? Dr. Sweli? Okay, Calvo.
Hello.
Dr. Calvo, okay. Professor Daniela Calvo.
Okay, so thank you very much for this invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm also learning a lot from the colleagues and from the previous speaks. I'm trying to share my screen. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. It's so interesting to hear also your talks and to learn from you. I am Daniela Calvo, an Italian anthropologist. I have a master's degree from the University of Turin in cultural anthropology and ethnology, a PhD in social sciences from the State University of Rio de Janeiro, and I just concluded a research in Japan on everything on Afro-Brazilian religions that I'm studying since 2010. I will ground my reflections on my research on Afro-Brazilian religions and also on what I'm learning from my participation within the PANAF and the development of a curriculum based on Yoruba spirituality for Nigerian schools that is coordinated by Dr. Paula Gomez. First of all, I consider decolonization as an ongoing process, since colonization continues to operate and reproduce in a variety of forms, including new ones, and as an effort that should take into account a multiplicity of voices and be conscious of the difficulties for many people to make their voice heard and participate in this construction. Decolonization should be a global project, being aware that there is not a single solution, but it should also take into account local, cultural, and sociopolitical differences, history, global processes, daily experiences and relationships, not only, as was said before, not only among humans, but also with other more than human beings that include natural beings like the land, the air, waters, animals, plants, forests, microbes, technology and artifacts, and spiritual beings. Speaking as an anthropologist, I would like to pose 2 main questions. How can anthropology advance in decolonizing itself, discourse, and academy? How can anthropology support decolonizing practices flourishing in various parts of the world? These are very ambitious questions, of course, but I would like to propose some reflections and some attempts from my research and focusing on especially on language, concepts, and methods. The colonial project tries to erase and subjugate African traditions, languages, forms of sociality, family and ethnic types, and the relations with homeland and ancestry, dismember Africa into the continent and its diaspora, and attack African cosmologies and religions by demonizing them. Colonization continues to attack African and Afro-diasporic worldviews and modes of existence in a variety of forms, imposing ways of naming and relating to, among others, the spiritual world, health, nature and the territory, food and gender. Concerning African ancestral religions, I agree with Oyonke Oyewumi that the demonization tried to attack the basis of African thought. And this is why, among Yoruba people, it was Eshu and Iyami, the ancestral mothers, that were particularly attacked and associated, respectively, with the Christian devil and witchcraft. Forms of resistance and resentizations are ongoing, and traditional practices are revitalized and used as a resource to find meaning and solution to new issues, as it happened during the COVID-19 pandemic and with environmental crisis. Rita Laura Segato observed that candomblé terreiros, as well as other African-derived traditional peoples, form an other population in Brazil, a niche of cultural preservation and creativity. And she says, the Afro-Brazilian religions constitute a very important niche of cultural preservation and creativity. These traditions have inscribed a monumental African codex containing the accumulated ethnic experience and strategies of African descendants as part of a nation. It contains a stable repertoire of images and make up a truly alternative myth, and the forms of conviviality they enforce spread far, affecting the society at large, well beyond the niches of orthodoxy, where the work of elaboration and preservation of this codex takes place. In this sense, this codex operates as a stable reservoir of meaning from which flows a capillary, informal, and fragmentary impregnation of the whole society. I would like to introduce an important concept that extends that of the colonial and post-colonial, that is counter-colonial. It was proposed by Brazilian quilombola activist and writer Antonio Bispo dos Santos, and I specify that Quilombo were originally communities of African descent that resisted slavery during colonization, and then came also to include other communities formed through territorial, social, cultural, and kinship relations. Antonio Bispo dos Santos starts from the premise that colonization, accompanied by Christianization, global processes, and the capitalist concept of progress is an ongoing process, which continues to operate and hampers the existence of other modes of existence, of nature, and the continuity of life. According to Antonio Bispo dos Santos, since nominating is dominating, language and epistemology are central in the elaboration of forms of resistance and flourishing that emerge from African ancestral traditions. A focus on language resonates with Brazilian intellectual, author, activist, and professor Lelian Gonzalez, and her refusal of a racist language, which prevents Black Brazilians from attaining an effective awareness of themselves as descendants of Africans, as well as with Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who focuses on languages as a tool of mental subjugation, and he proposes to remember Africa, Africa's body and soul, which has been brutally dismembered during colonization, to combat deprivation, dispossession, and exploitation, as well as to reform identity and resistance to associating foreign influences through the use of indigenous African languages. Colonizers' language dramatically shows its effects in the imposition of Portuguese names and later also surnames on enslaved Africans and their descendants. European name-giving implied their dismembering, the erasure of their connection with ancestry, and the impossibility of reconstructing their genealogy, while linking them and baptism and acculturation. Leandro Fonseca Misiato notes that the beginning of Italy's life coming from Africa was initially due to the rupture of identity. The Black person who recognized himself or herself as a transpersonal being, identified and identifying from the innumerable ancestral elements of his or her land, saw himself or herself as someone disembodied, fragmented in his or her origin, as someone who reflected the other, the colonizer, and no longer himself or herself. Thus, the negation of the name has functioned for the colonizer as a nominative strategy for objectifying Black lives, as implied the enslaved persons in the disorganization of themselves, in the weakening of their ancestral potency, and the obstruction of the secular sense of being a person. Names are thus important pieces in remembering Blackness, similarly to what Nombulelo Shang noted in South Africa, where the revival of Khoi and some names, as well as the people and events they were connected to, is another method of remembering and reconstructing the self through memory. In Brazil, the growing tendency to register children with African names, which usually involves the one received in the ritual divination of Icomojadé, according to Ifa tradition that is spreading in Brazil, or to have the name received after Ifa or Candomblé initiation in the African language of their nation, materializes the spiritual connection with African ancestry. However, some public officials resist these attempts at renaming, expressing another form of institutional racism and resistance to Black identity claims. Using European languages in our oral and written communications binds us to a certain language and terminology, which has historical and cultural connotations and configures lifestyles, practices, and relationships. Just to make an example, Candomblé is often defined in scholars' works as monotheism or polytheism. This echoes was what said before in a previous talk. And this depends on the choice to focus on Olodumare or Olorum as the supreme god or the Orisha as multiple gods. Indeed, both the definitions are incorrect, since neither the Orishas nor Olodumare correspond to the Western concept of God, of Theos in Greek, as noted also, among others, by Jacopo Lupona. Moreover, some re-elaborations of Yoruba cosmology sustain the presence of three gods which correspond to the Holy Trinity, Olorum, Obatala, and Orunmila. Some scholars and practitioners argue that thinking Yoruba cosmology as a monotheism or based on this trinity corresponds to an attempt to legitimize them by molding these cosmologies according to Christian model, instead of claiming the strength, independence, and dignity of African ancestral worldview. The problem of language and terminology still remains unsolved when we are communicating in an European language, and we oscillate between the use of terms which do not reflect the complexity and nuances of local concepts and the lack of proper words. A possible and provisional solution is to avoid taking for granted that when we use the same terms, we are speaking of the same thing, and using, when possible, specific terms in local languages and trying to explain their complexity. Just to make an example, for the practitioners of Afro-Brazilian religions, the river is a watercourse, a source of life, the domain of Oshun, the expression of Oshun's potency and of fertility and nourishment, a sacred place where important rituals happen, the source of life, and the sacred element that is used in many rituals, among other meanings that depend on the context and the complex sensorial, affective, and intuitive relationship with the world that is developed a long time. Henceforth, it is important for anthropologists to uncover and denounce the various forms in which colonialism appears, even in covert ways, in daily practices, through a dialogue with the research interlocutors and native scholars and accurate reflections, and to take seriously the proposal of Donna Haraway, who says, "Stay with the trouble." Dialogue with research collaborators at any phase of the research, elaboration of research methodologies, fieldwork, elaboration of data and ideas, writing, and the literature produced by native scholars and insiders is fundamental, as well as the participation in broader discussions on anthropological research and decolonial methods with people from and studying other ethnographical contexts. For instance, in the past years, I have been increasingly collaborating with scholars from India. That is a very different ethnographical context, but which has enriched my reflections and critical thought. I will give an example from my research on how concepts from African ancestral religions enable us to deeply rethink the basis of our thought and the pervasiveness of colonial ways of thinking. Nature and human relationships with nature is a theme that has always been part of my research interest, especially in relation with health. During COVID-19 pandemic, many reflections from practitioners of Afro-Brazilian religions addressed the pandemic and showed its connection with an imbalanced relationship with nature, in line with many intellectuals and indigenous peoples around the world. The pandemic was seen as a symptom of an imbalanced relationship between human beings and nature, marked by the exploitation of resources, the destruction of ecosystems, and the pollution of the earth, water, and air. They emphasized the possibility of human existence only as part of an interconnected world, in a field of relationships based on respect for humanity, all living beings, and nature. For my reflections, the thought of Antonio Bispo dos Santos was central, and this iconic sentence, "The land belongs to us, the land does not belong to us, we belong to the land." Based on Afro-Brazilian modes of existence, he observes that the separation of humans from nature, what he calls a synthetic thought and action on nature, and cosmophobia, are all products of the Bible's original pity narrative. He defines the synthetic thought and action of nature as a process based on having, owning, on the production of things, which he contrasts with the organic knowledge, which is based on reality and being and is linked to life. And cosmophobia is defined as the fear of the cosmos. He says that, according to the Bible, after Adam and Eve's original pity, eating the forbidden fruit, they and their descendants could no longer eat the fruit, the leaves of anything that the land offered, and were instead condemned to eat only by the sweat of their brow. He observed that at the moment he created the work as an action of synthesizing nature, so they would need to synthesize everything, and so they went out into the world synthesizing, including themselves. This gave rise to a process that leads to the deterritorialization of people, since the relation with their land is attacked, and to the exploitation of nature, and can lead to the destruction of both nature and the human beings, since having, owning, is the creature that divorces its creator, says Antonio Bispo dos Santos. These observations echo with the concept of brutalism proposed by Achille Mbembe, who also posed the following question during the pandemic. Will we be able to rediscover our belonging to the same species and our unbreakable bond with all life? Another important tool of analysis was the principle of incompleteness proposed by Cameroonian anthropologist based in South Africa, Francis Nyam-John, who considers incompleteness as the basis of African thought and forms of being, becoming and relating to other beings. Incompleteness denotes a capacity to play with limits and expand possibilities for flexibility and inclusiveness. He says, conviviality challenges us to be open-minded and open-ended in our claims and articulations of identities, being and belonging. Conviviality encourages us to reach out, encounter and explore ways of enhancing or complementing ourselves with the added possibility of potency brought our way by the incompleteness of others, human, natural, superhuman, and supernatural alike. Never as a ploy to become complete, an extravagant illusion ultimately, but to make us more efficacious in our relationships and sociality. The dialogue with these and other African and Afro-Brazilian authors and my research collaborators, my research experience brought me to develop reflections on forms of conceiving and living with other beings in African ancestral traditions, and to establish dialogues with other indigenous authors, like Brazilian indigenous leader and writer Ailton Krenak, but also posthumanistic thought and various authors reflecting on conviviality, ecology, and more than human relations and health, like for instance Donna Haraway and Anna Singh and Bruno Latour. I would like to conclude with some reflections on research methodology. During my research on Afro-Brazilian religions, I learned the importance to mold my fieldwork according to Afro-Brazilian forms of passing down knowledge and know-how, and to form skills and sensibilities. Circular and dialogical ways of sharing and co-creating knowledge, the engagement of the researcher, bodily experience and emotions in fieldwork, and the use of life stories, which are not only an important method of analysis, sharing of knowledge in writing, but also a forum to preserve the memory of people. Ethical issues concerning delicate data and the protection of research participants was completely redefined in the field, taking a path that departs from what I learned through academy. In fact, dialogues on how to write about their life experiences, including traumatic ones, revealed that academic writing represents for my research participants also a form to challenge common prejudices and opinions on Afro-Brazilian religions, to make complex thoughts, complex and ethical values available to a wider public, and to preserve their memory. According to my research participants, telling their stories provides examples of overcoming difficulties, changing one's life, letting the orishas operate in their lives, and living according to other principles and ethical values that can help many people to reflect on and find ways for positive changes in their lives and in the forms of approaching complex social problems, like, to name just a few, mental crisis, violence against women, gender relations, education, food provision, health, care, and conviviality. I leave you some references, and I thank you for your attention. And I also want to thank all the people who shared their stories and reflections with me and made this work possible.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Calvo. That was a very enlightening delivery. That showed that you have traversed the whole world across from the east to the west, oceans, Pacific, Atlantic, I mean, it shows in your presentation. Thank you very much for this thing. And then you went through everything, and like I said earlier in my speech, that when they are talking of the Garden of Eden, that happened 3,500 BC, and we have archaeological facts here that is 30,000 BC. So definitely we are not from that stock. And when the son of Adam went to another community to marry a wife, he didn't marry his mother. He married somebody who had been existing. So those are areas we still need to really emphasize on this their story and tell our story according to the objective of this discussion. Thank you very much, Dr. Daniela Calvo. That was good. Thank you. Thank you. Well done. So I raise applause for your claps. Thank you very much.